Everybody, video here for you today. Not sure when this is going to get uploaded. I've been a little busy lately, but let's go down to the Great Sphinx today. If there is one question that has been a common theme through my 8 or 9 years on YouTube is how old is the Sphinx exactly? Of course, this is called the Great Sphinx because when the Greeks moved in here about 2,400 years ago, they changed the mythology of Egypt. They changed this original shrine into a lion sphinx. Part of their mythology has nothing to do with the civilization who built this place originally. This has been talked about by a lot of people, and of course, John Anthony West and Robert Schoch, when they were here in the 90s, that kind of brought this all to the surface. In the Nile River, people say, well, how long could it have migrated over to the middle of the Nile Valley over here? Well, personally, I think this whole valley was water at one time. If I back out here, you can see where the modern Nile is, right over here. Personally, I think when these sacred structures were built, the whole valley was filled with water from one end to the other. Now, I don't care about giving you the exact right answer. I just care about giving you the right evidence here. And a lot of people say, well, this is just a great mystery and we'll probably never solve it. Well, I say that's a bunch of hogwash. We have more information at our fingertips now than we ever have. So let's get this mystery solved. This is a great question from antiquity here. This is what we see today as we sit and ponder history. How far back does human history go? And what were humans capable of maybe 10, 12,000 years ago? These are the ruins we see today. Experts, so-called experts, say these were built in the Old Kingdom. But is that correct? Personally, I think these monuments are over 11,000 years old. And I know maybe 25 years ago, if you were to say something like that, 30 years ago, you'd get laughed at. But now, with all we know, Göbekli Tepe, many other places, seems humans were capable of pretty incredible things about 12,000 years ago. The highly eroded Sphinx here is guarding the most sacred necropolis in Egypt, and I think it's time we just got in touch with the ancient texts. They tell us exactly what this monument is or was a long time ago. The temple of Anubis upon his hill, that's what the translation is in the oldest sacred text about ancient Rostov, which is Giza today. And this whole area out here with the buildings was water when these structures were built here. But here today, the sands of time have kind of covered up history here. The true form of these original structures is lost, but they are built with such big blocks that still a lot of it remains today. This temple was called the Temple of Tep-2F right here. And people say, well, how can you think these structures were built in the early 9,000 BCs, but still call this Anubis? That's a very Egyptian thing. Well, do you believe the Egyptian dynasties started in the first dynasty, like Zahi Hawass says? Or are you going to listen to the dynastic Egyptians themselves, who say their civilization is a legacy civilization and their king's list goes way back, a lot further back than 3100 BC? So are you going to listen to the experts or listen to the best evidence and the Egyptians themselves? Well, that's all up to the individual, I guess. As I said before, I believe what we call the Nile River today, back about 11,000 years ago, extended all the way from the eastern valley ridge all the way over to the west side, to right in front of what we call the Sphinx today. And this was a harbor right in front of here. You see these ruins right out in front of here. We have no idea what's under here. There's stuff buried way down under the sand, and that just hints that this place is very, very ancient. We have texts saying 11,600 years ago from Plato that something really bad happened. Great civilization sank to the bottom of the sea. We have Egyptian and Mayan texts saying the survivors came to these parts of the world and started civilization again. That would have been about 11,000 years ago, based on what we know, what we've learned over the last 20 years, that something really bad did actually happen in that time frame. I think the survivors built these structures right here. If you ask about Atlantis, I think this is closer to Atlantis, what we see in the Giza Plateau today, than the Egyptian civilization, that is for sure. Anubis, as we call him today, that is a Greek word. There is an original name for this jackal-type god that was the original god of Giza. It says he is the shrine and he sits in the divine booth. Second definition of booth is enclosure. The ancient Egyptians tell us exactly what this structure was, but that's not the meaning of this video, or that's not the purpose of this video, just how old this structure was. But since the so-called experts have their heads stuck in the sand here about looking at all the evidence, I think it's important what was found very deep down here. Now I'm going to play a clip from John Anthony West. I'm going to be sharing a few clips from a few different videos on the Sphinx subject. Well, let's just listen to John Anthony West, what was found pretty deep right down
back
here.
In the 70s, or somewhere around there, early, maybe even 60s, the weather, whatever the people are who test for water levels, you know, water table levels, were doing a test here, and they drilled down. They were checking, I guess, something of the sort, taking core samples, whatever, and they drilled down here and got down, I think, 22 meters, so that's 70 feet, and hit a piece of granite. That is significant because granite, only granite in Egypt comes from far to the south in Aswan. So they hit a piece of granite, and they think now, because you see this excavation stuff here is relatively recent, and they think that's part of an old harbor that stretched from the Nile to here. I'm not sure of that. But the granite is interesting because it means that either, if this were a harbor, something fell off into the, and the harbor, I mean, it's 22 meters, so it's deep. So something is there, or it's part of a structure that's that deep, which would really be significant. I mean, that would be a major discovery.
But I think that's highly interesting. How do you explain granite found almost 65, 70 feet below the sand here? I think this place in its original form would just blow us away, what it actually looked like when it was first built. Would the Antiquities Council actually allow exploration below here, way deep down? No, probably not. But that's just one of the many mysteries. The head of the Sphinx seems to have been recarved way too small for the body. It is the least eroded part of the monument, but the part of the monument that has been exposed to the elements for the most amount of time. How do you explain that? Let's talk about how many years the body has been covered by sand, yet that is the most eroded part of the monument. This is just a huge mystery, probably why we don't have any solid answers. Here is the body of the monument, and I believe this is the part that was carved by the dynastic Egyptians. Personally, I just think this was part of the neck of the original shrine, and the head of the original shrine might not even have been made of stone, but this was made out of the living rock, the living stone here, as they called it in their text, because it's part of the natural mound that was once here. But I'm going to play a clip from a podcast that Ben and I at UnchartedX did. He uploaded on his channel. I uploaded this on my channel. But Ben did all the work on this. We talked about the Sphinx for quite a while, but let's just play the part here where we talked about how long this monument has been buried here. The true form has been covered up, but there is some good pics from the 1830s that show the original form of the paws. They certainly tell a story in my eyes.
Indeed, yeah, I know you do a lot of work on the Sphinx, the Anubis, likely being the Anubis statue back in the day. I mean, it's pretty obvious, just the head. I mean, you can tell how the head has been recarved in terms of it just proportion-wise doesn't really fit the body.
And supposedly the body has been buried for a long time, yet that shows all the erosion and the head doesn't, and the head has what has been exposed for the time that we know it to have been around, so
that's an excellent point.
Makes no sense.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. That's one of the reasons that, you know, it seems likely that Robert Schoch's dating of it seems to be the most legitimate dating from a geological perspective. The idea that the walls of the enclosure and even the body of the Sphinx, like you can see the erosion. The idea that that's wind and sand is just it's a strange conclusion to make when if you give the Sphinx, what is it, 50 years or so without continually removing the sand, it pretty much gets buried up to its neck again in fairly short order. And I think you mentioned to me when we were talking about this that it's something like 2/3 of the time that we think the Sphinx has been there it's been buried up to its neck or thereabouts for around 2/3 of that time that it's actually been there.
Well, why don't I just talk about that and just show you here what I'm talking about there.
Yeah.
For the 4,700 years that we know the Sphinx has been around, we know that it has been buried for at least 3,300 of those years.
Right.
It was uncovered around the 4th dynasty when they said they were going to repair the monument. That's what the priests of Khufu say, that they are repairing these monuments, not that they were built in this time. We know that Tutmosis uncovered it in the 18th dynasty, and we know the Romans uncovered it, but we know it's been buried for 3,300 years of the supposed 4,700 years it's been around. So where did all this erosion come from? And how come the old dynasty put repair blocks in erosion grooves that would have taken thousands of years to, evolve? The story we are told about when the Sphinx is built is totally wrong if you just look at all the evidence and just use some common sense, in my eyes.
Yeah, I would agree. It certainly seems older than that. I mean, just the erosion alone, even regardless if you assume it was wind and sand or water erosion, as Robert Schoch says, it still seems like that would take a longer period of time to achieve than what we give it. It feels like it was ancient in ancient times.
Right. Herodotus never mentioned it because I think all that was sticking up was part of the head.
Right.
But certainly a great mystery, because I think even to the Egyptians, the true original form was lost to them. I think that all happened back in the maybe the 5th or 6th dynasty when something really bad happened in Egypt, when the main god of Egypt changed to, the main god of Giza at least, changed to what we know as Osiris today. So it's, I don't know. I've talked about the Sphinx a lot, and when the Greeks come in and change it to a lion, change everything to their mythology in Egypt, they change Thoth to Hermes, they change the falcon statues down at Thebes to the Colossus of Memnon, which is a totally Greek thing.
Right.
And that name comes from a story where these statues in the morning, they would actually kind of make a whistling hum, and that's how the Greeks attached the Colossus of Memnon to those statues. So everything becomes Greek, and this shrine becomes, they change it from a dog to a cat, in my eyes.
Yeah.
Always nice making a video with Ben, and I'm sure we're going to do one in the future. We talk a lot on Skype, but it's my belief here that the pyramids of Giza and the Sphinx were all built at the same time for one purpose. This is an ancient necropolis, the most important one in Egypt. Only Anubis is allowed to be showed at the entrance to a necropolis. Would they have varied from that in the most important necropolis in all of Egypt? I doubt it. Let's talk about John Anthony West here, one of the most important people in my research. If I never would have read some of his work, I probably would have never got interested in ancient Egypt and the deep mysteries and making videos in the first place. Let's just listen to him talk about a bunch of things right down here in front of the Sphinx, including some mysteries about the age here.
And another, a papyrus, rather fragmentary, but both these documents talk about long earlier periods where Egypt was ruled first by the Necheru, that is to say the gods themselves, the gods to be understood not as figments of the superstitious imagination, but as the embodiments or manifestations of cosmic principles. And then almost as an afterthought, at the very end of this long chapter, said, of course, the Great Sphinx of Giza shows unmistakable signs of aquatic erosion, water weathering. And when I read that, I was working on my own book, Serpent in the Sky, which is designed to introduce the English-speaking people to Schwaller's work, which was only in French at that time and impenetrable in any language, pretty much. You tried reading unadulterated Schwaller. It's like taking your first driving lesson in a Ferrari. Anyhow, that registered with me because everything else that he was talking about was a textual argument, interesting certainly, but not science. The water weathering of the Sphinx was potentially science. And if you could prove that, you could prove something very important. It's not just a quibble amongst academics, because I think you get the sense here, I don't think anybody would argue or probably not argue much, that the Great Sphinx is probably the greatest statue on Earth. If it's proven that the Sphinx is weathered by water, and it's proven that it dates, we can't date it yet specifically, but it's somewhere older than 10,000 BC, it means that everything you've ever learned in any school, anywhere in the world, about the origins of human civilization is completely wrong. I mean, not only is it's totally wrong, and it's reversed. In other words, they could do what we can't do. Yeah, we can build hydrogen bombs, and we've got bobblehead dolls and striped toothpaste and all kinds of wonderful things like that. But we couldn't build a temple like that even if we wanted to, and we don't want to. But it still wasn't science because I'm not a scientist. It turned out I did a pretty good job. I made only a couple of big mistakes. It took another 10 years before I finally encountered Robert Schoch, my now good friend and colleague, who was a young but very impeccably credentialed geologist with sort of triple PhD from Yale in geology, geophysics, and paleontology. And it took another more long story to get him interested enough to come to Egypt with me to take a look at the weathering and to pronounce on whether or not it was indeed water weathered. And it was funny, he used this, when he first walked in, we came in, and as you see, this is pretty impressive to come down here. And it was just, I forget exactly how we got permission or if we bakshished our way in. We were in all by ourselves early in the morning, and Schoch walked around with me, and okay, follow me now. We'll get here. So we got to about here. And so anybody else, you're walking around here, if you weren't with me, you wouldn't probably think twice to look at the side wall there. You'd be looking at the Sphinx, at the art, not at the rocks. Schoch is a geologist, so what he's looking at are the rocks. And you walked in, and you've got a view of this here, a little bit closer than we are now. And you all of a sudden stopped, and he said, oh, wow. He said, these rocks look like they're hundreds of thousands of years old. And he said, ooh, don't quote me on that. now 20, what's it, more than 20 years later, because he hadn't yet conceded, as it were, that it had to be water weathering. Initially, he couldn't believe that the geologists hadn't noticed that before because it was so absolutely obvious. But now he's perfectly okay with, maybe not hundreds of thousands, but old beyond any possible, impossible to place within any kind of a contemporary framework. In one sense, you could say that argument is, so what? What does it have to do with the price of eggs or the price of Ferraris or anything like that? Actually, a lot. I don't think there's anyone here who thinks other than that we're living in a lunatic asylum, which is breaking apart as we watch it. But at the end of a couple of weeks here, what you end up with is an unshakable understanding of the difference between civilization and progress. They're almost antithetical, damn near. And you don't think of that otherwise because we're all brought up to think that we're the smartest people that ever were. And for a couple of weeks here, you get to understand that, yeah, we can do certain technological things that probably they couldn't do, but they wouldn't have wanted to do. And they not only can do things, they did things that were infinitely more important, and they did them for 3,000 years. I mean, we've had our own society, at least in America, going for a couple of hundred years, and it's coming apart at the seams. Obviously, every time you pick up the newspaper, there's something that's making it worse.
Now, it's my belief that this thing was already weathered when the Old Kingdom was here, the 4th Dynasty, the Kingdom of Khufu and Khafre. The evidence that they built these structures is flimsy at best. Let's listen to John Anthony West talk about the absurdity that the Old Kingdom actually built this originally, based on some of the repair blocks here.
Any questions? Oh, who said 4? Sorry. Point out what's original and what isn't original here. And the repair blocks. Actually, important point. Obviously, above the repair blocks is the weathering. That's the core body of the Sphinx. Then there are many stages of repair, and this is again a complicated subject, but architectural styles, in architectural, if you take a course in architectural art history, certain styles are associated with certain periods of construction, and there's no mistaking. For example, a medieval fortress is a medieval fortress. It's not a Roman fortress, and it's not an Egyptian fortress. So these repair campaigns have their own style. So these big ones on the bottom here are typically Old Kingdom. That means somewhere between, the Sphinx is supposedly carved in 2450 or thereabouts, 2500 BC. The Old Kingdom ends in 2200 BC. So it means that, and even Lehner acknowledges that, and some of them, that the Sphinx was weathered to its present condition when the first repair blocks were applied. But if the first repair blocks were applied within a couple of hundred years of the Sphinx is being carved, this is an absurdity. I mean, there's no possible way that you can defend that scientifically.
Well, let's just play a clip here talking about the water erosion on the divine booth here. I'm not going to call it the enclosure because the ancient text says what this is. They call it the divine booth. The water erosion here, John Anthony West is just going to talk about it briefly here.
It wasn't until I got here with Schoch, one mistake I'd made, one big mistake in my original developing of the theory was that I couldn't even see, for a variety of reasons, I was convinced that it was water weathering, but it never occurred to me that it was rainwater weathering. And Schoch was able to point that out, because you see the verticals there, and the verticals here, that can only occur if, for example, if this were all enclosed and it were a lake, and it was all standing water, you wouldn't get those verticals. The verticals come in because it's water coursing down the plateau. The plateau goes back up that way, you notice, as we came down in the bus. And it's tilted like, if you can imagine like a ping pong table that's tilted west to east and then north to south, so that it's like this. And the water coming down, and this is where we want our panel of geologists, lots and lots of water is coming down over long periods of time, almost certainly bouncing off the causeway. There's the ruins of the causeway up on top, and it's spilling over this third of the Sphinx enclosure wall, much more so than the other enclosure, the far end, the eastern end of the enclosure wall. And what that's producing, because even what you're looking at here is illusory, because the original line, come back here. Okay, now turn around and you get sort of where I am, and sight down here. You see, this is the layers are laid down north, south, west, east as well, so that this is a much harder layer of limestone, and that's a much softer layer of limestone, and the head itself is a still harder outcrop of limestone. But where I'm standing here is the original profile of the enclosure wall, right? It was once out to here, so it's weathered from here to there. That's a lot of weathering.
Personally, I think this monument is about 11,300 years old, if you want me to be specific, but, well, what do I know? At some point in history, a heck of a lot of water poured over here. The limestone enclosure is heavily eroded by water in areas. If that much water would have flowed over here in the last 4,500 years, which it didn't, those mud brick pyramids would be a pile of unrecognizable ruins. Also, we should think about rainout events that possibly happened in the last 11,000 years, where we maybe had an impact in an ocean and it rained for weeks or months. That could have caused a lot of the erosion here. That's my video. What we call the Sphinx today certainly wasn't called that originally. Some people say, well, this is just a great mystery. We'll never get to the bottom of it. Well, those words will never be uttered on this channel. I think we should get down to this mystery because this is the greatest shrine in the world ever built. Still here today. We don't know the real answers to this, and I think we should. I think it's time we start listening to the ancient Egyptians. They say they were a legacy civilization. That means something came before them. John Anthony West went over the gods of Egypt. They weren't gods. They were just highly civilized people who knew a lot of things we don't give them credit for. Hope you thought that was interesting. And you all have a very nice day.